Welcome to the Spoken Tome Audiobooks podcast series. In this episode, Mark Jeftovic talks with David A. Stockman, author of Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and the Fantasy of MAGA. You need to hear this.
Hi, everyone. Mark Jeftovic here from Spoken Tome Media, and I'm very excited to be here with David A. Stockman, the author of Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and the Delusion of MAGA. Mr. Stockman was elected from Michigan's 4th Congressional District at the age of 30, making him the youngest congressman ever elected until the recent election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I might edit that. He was Ronald Reagan's director of the Office of Management and Budget and is regarded by some as the father of Reaganomics. After politics, he went to work for the Salomon Brothers Investment Bank and was later a partner in the Blackstone Group. Now he's an independent political and economic commentator. He's written 3 books: The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America, which was a postmortem of the 2008 global financial crisis, Trumped, A Nation on the Brink of Ruin and How to Bring It Back, and most recently, the one we just released the audiobook for, Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and the Delusion of MAGA. So, Mr. Stockman, happy 4th of July. Thanks for taking time out of your Independence Day holidays to join me for a talk.
Yes, well, very happy to be with you, and I think we got a lot of important territory to cover. So,
well, let's try to get to it. Okay. Yeah. I think all 3 of your books cover a grand arc of what I call the end game of Keynesian economics or Keynesian economics. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to work our way up to Peak Trump briefly by spending some time covering the backdrop of the 2 earlier books. So The Great Deformation, I would sum up in one sentence, was that the bailouts were unnecessary and destructive, and we've essentially painted ourselves into a corner, while Trumped looks at how that paved the way for a populist like Trump to disrupt the field and ultimately win the election. So could you tell us a little bit about those 2 books and how they lead into this one? Or not, yeah. if I've got that wrong.
I think they actually do. The bailouts in 2008 were a huge mistake, but they didn't happen randomly out of the blue. My argument is in that book that for upwards of 100 years, we had been drifting away from what I call the foundation principles of free markets and small government, sound money, and basically capitalist prosperity based on people pursuing their own best interests. And it all started with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1914. The Federal Reserve got distorted, let's say hijacked a couple years later to finance World War I, which was a huge mistake. We never should have been involved. That paved the way for what I call the American empire, the indispensable nation, the activist, interventionist foreign policy that leads to the point that we're at today, where we have bases in 100 countries and we're spending trillions that we don't have for a military establishment that we don't need. Domestically, it led to the New Deal, to the expansion of government, of the state, as we call it, to a growing fiscal crisis that was addressed and partly rolled back in the Reagan era or in the early 1980s. That I was a part of, but by then it had so much momentum, so much political resilience, let's say, in our politics, that very little changed despite the change in rhetoric from Ronald Reagan. From there, we drifted into a huge mistake, and that is the Cold War ended. The reason for institutions like NATO was no more. We didn't need at that point the $500 billion defense budget that had been, built up over the decades to contain the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was gone. This was a moment where what I call 75 years of warfare from 1914 forward finally came to an end. It was a great opening for peace, but Washington blew it. and Washington blew it because there was so much vested interest in the military-industrial complex, the entire national security apparatus, I call it the welfare state, that instead of demobilizing our military and dismantling all of these structures that were now obsolete from the Cold War, we went in the opposite direction with all these interventions, beginning with the unnecessary intervention in the Gulf War I, which inexorably led to the whole mess that we have today in the Middle East. Now, along the way, the Federal Reserve became even more interventionist, activist, committed to what I call Keynesian macro management of the economy. That generated not more prosperity and a better life for the middle class, but simply a larger and larger bubble on Wall Street and a growing maldistribution of wealth in which the 1% prospered mightily as the stock markets rose higher and higher, even as the real standard of living, which I measure by, say, median real household income, has essentially stagnated for the last 20 or 30 years. This came to a head in 2008 when our economy became saturated with debt as a result of the cheap money policies of the Fed and their efforts to drive interest rates to rock bottom. It led to the housing bubble and the crash. And then instead of recognizing that we had been drifting in the wrong direction for decades, what they did at the time of the crisis in 2008, when Lehman Brothers went into bankruptcy, was they doubled down on the same thing. The federal debt exploded. It was already $9 trillion at the time. Before long, it was $20 trillion and now $22 trillion today. Rather than recognizing that the Fed had overdone it and put too much pressure on interest rates and intervened too heavily in financial markets, they went all out with this thing called quantitative easing and a massive creation of money that amounted to about $3.5 trillion between the eve of the crisis and the present time. So we doubled down. That created for a few years the appearance of recovery, but overwhelmingly the recovery was on Wall Street and in the stock averages. It wasn't on Main Street and real wages and real income and living standards for the 90% of the American public that doesn't own many financial assets. The evidence for that I provide in the book, I think is quite striking. And that is if you look at the NASDAQ 100, which is really the index that measures the technology sector and the real leading edge of the stock market boom that we've had since the crisis, it's up 200% in real terms, even if I squeeze the inflation out of the index number, 200%. But if we look at real household income, what the average American family out there in flyover America has after inflation, it's up 0%. So my argument in the book is Trump came along because there was this tremendous divergence between the boom on Wall Street and the unspeakable prosperity that came to the 1% and 10% that own almost all of the stock, and the frustration and stagnation that occurred in much of Main Street America, and particularly what I call flyover America, those parts that were left behind as our industrial economy migrated offshore, again, as a result of these destructive fiscal and monetary policies. Now, Trump, therefore, was elected as a signal of distress. He didn't have a program that was all that coherent. He didn't have an agenda that really had any capability to fix the problem, but he was a symbol, a expression of this is wrong, it's got to stop, we need a new direction. That led to my book, the book that I wrote on the eve of the election. unfortunately, Trump has been in office now for 2.5 years. And what I said in the original book and what I'm saying in Peak Trump is that it's clear he doesn't have a program. He is the great disruptor. He has thrown, his Twitter account and his considerable girth into the wheels of government, but it hasn't really fixed anything. And he's bragging about an outcome that ironically is the end stage of the very big, fat, ugly bubble that he attacked during the campaign. If you remember during the campaign, he said, the unemployment rate published by the BLS is fake, and that's true. It vastly exaggerates how much progress we've made, since if you work a few hours a week, you count as employed, and if you're making the minimum wage and working 10 hours a week, you're starving, but that's a job. He was right about that. He cited my numbers. I say, if you look actually at the hours that are available from the adult population versus the hours that are worked, the unemployment rate is more like 30 or 40%, not 4%. He also said the stock market was being pumped up artificially. He's absolutely right. But at the time he said that, in October 2016, the stock market was about, S&P 500, that is, was about 2,000. Today it's 3,000. Then it was a big, fat, ugly bubble. Today it's a vindication for Trumpian policies. Well, you can't have it both ways. And what I'm finally saying is that if you boast about it and you implement policies that break it, you own it. And I think that is where we are at this moment in time. The Trump trade war is a total mistake. It's going to lead to a global recession that the U.S. will not escape, no matter how much Trump tweets boldly about what he's accomplished. The fiscal situation in America is a catastrophe. It was bad enough when he inherited a $20 trillion debt from his 44 predecessors, but now he's giving fiscal recklessness a new name. He has built policies at the very tippy top of a business cycle that have never been seen before. By that, I mean $1 trillion deficit 10 years after allegedly the emergency ended and the Great Recession was over. This is off the charts. Even the Keynesian, doctrinaire Keynesians of the heyday in the 60s and 1970s, when I started in Washington and as a young staffer on Capitol Hill, even they said, you try to deal with a budget over the business cycle, and yes, they were for big spending and stimulus if you had a deep recession at the bottom of a cycle, but they said, when you get recovered and you get to the top or end of a cycle, you need to get your fiscal house in order, and if nothing else, get ready for the next cycle. Well, we're doing the opposite. We're doubling down on the public debt at a time when we should be running surpluses, and we're going into the 2020s when the baby boom is retiring 80 million people, and ironically, Trump is the leading edge of the baby boom. He's the same age I am. He was born in 1946. That's year one of the baby boom. 1962 was the end of it. That's 80 million people. They're all going to be retiring in the 2020s, putting immense pressure on Social Security, Medicare, the whole apparatus of the welfare state, which means that if we're going to get our fiscal house in order, it needed to be done before we got to what I call the tsunami of baby boom retirees. Now, Trump has done the opposite. He has, dug us deeper into a fiscal hole exactly when the real pressure on government borrowing and government budgets is going to begin to accelerate. So I guess the net of it is I argued and used in my title, Peak Trump, because I think it happened in the first and second year of his administration. He inherited a tired business cycle, and at the end of a business cycle, the unemployment rate is always low. At the end of a credit boom like we had from all the money printing by the Fed, the stock market is always high, but neither of those were a sign of sustainable health, of real progress. They were artificial consequences of too much money printing and too much borrowing. Now he's bragging about it. He's embracing it. He's, tweeting about it almost every day. But I think, we're near the end of the road. When the market finally collapses under its own weight, and I think it will soon, it will trigger another recession. And then all of a sudden, everything that he's bragging about that had nothing to do with his policies, will be in shambles. So we're heading into a very fraught time between now and the election. I think all the chickens are going to come home to roost. Our politics are more divisive and angry and confrontational than they've ever been before. And I can remember a fair amount. I started on Capitol Hill in 1970. Nothing like this we've seen before. And when the last shoe falls, which is to say the artificial stock market bubble collapses and the U.S. economy rolls over into recession, that is, we return to the crisis of 2008 that was never really solved, just kicked down the road, so to speak. All of this is going to make for a very vicious, I'm afraid, nasty, difficult political campaign as we go into 2020. So that's kind of how the whole picture weaves together, but it's kind of, an outcome, vectors of history, let's call them, that have been in motion for a long time. The warfare state that's bankrupting us and creating crises all around the world that make us less secure, not more. And the welfare state that's taking down, our national debt, and a Federal Reserve that is functioning basically for the 1%, and, really damaging badly savers and workers and average people throughout flyover America.
I made so many notes while you were talking there. I don't know which direction to go, but I was thinking as I read the book, or actually, well, I listened to it because I was listening to Russell's rough chapters. Despite the title of this book and the title of the previous book, I get the sense that Trump is more of a sign of the times rather than being a driver of them. But then as I listen to you speaking to how he's on precisely the wrong side of some of these shifts that are in progress, maybe he's even more of a catalyzing factor now, where this is all events and forces in motion that were inevitable. I love Doug Casey's famous maxim, just because something is inevitable doesn't make it imminent. But maybe Trump is now flipping to the wrong side of these. He didn't listen to your playbook. He said, Reagan spent the whole first term blaming Carter for everything. So then he can get on the right side of the shift and then say, okay, now from this point onward, it's all my doing. And Trump did precisely the opposite. So maybe he's making what was inevitable imminent now.
Yeah, I think so. And I called it a rookie mistake in my book. I said that he should have gotten out Ronald Reagan's playbook. I remember it well. I was there beside him, really, practically every day. And even when the economy began to turn around in 1982, we had a very bad recession. He inherited double-digit inflation. People couldn't even imagine today, a CPI going up at 11, 12% a year. The Treasury 10-year note at the time that I became budget director was yielding 15%. That's how much it cost for 1 year to carry $1 of debt. That scared the hell out of everybody. And he basically inherited all that. It began to turn around because he let Volcker do what needed to be done. The chairman of the Fed, he threw on the brakes. He brought inflation to its knees and began to purge the rot that had built up in the economy during the 1970s. Now, all the way through here, Reagan allowed the cure to be imposed, continued to remind people how we got here. It didn't happen January 1981 and February 1981. It was 10, 20 years in the making. And finally, when we got to Morning in America, that was 1984. The worst of the crisis was behind us. The recession had ended. Jobs were booming again. The economy, the GDP was growing 5-6% on a quarterly basis. Then finally, and even then he didn't boast about it, he said, you know, we've righted the ship of state. We've changed our policies and principles, and now we need to persevere in the right direction. Now, he made a lot of mistakes, too. The deficit got out of control. He allowed the military-industrial complex to get, well, defense budget way beyond what we needed, and we could talk about that in a different context. But rather than studying that, Trump is such an egomaniac that from day 2 in office, all of a sudden he looked around. He inherited an unemployment rate that was, 4.1% at the time, almost at the lowest point in history, and started bragging about it. Well, what did he do in 1 month? What did he do in 3 months? Our economy is it's a $20 trillion ship of state. It takes months and quarters and years to turn the direction. He didn't have much to do with what was really a pretty lackluster recovery, but he began to embrace it right away. Now, on your point about whether he's a sign or consequence of history or a catalyst, I think it's really important to understand that he arrived in the Oval Office as a sign of the times, as a fluke of history. I mean, let's face it, Donald Trump was the worst candidate either major party has ever put up for office. And I can remember some bad campaigns. Barry Goldwater, as a young kid in high school, I was an enthusiastic conservative in those days. I supported him, but he got wiped off the map. He was a terrible candidate by Lyndon Johnson. Or you can go back earlier. As I say, often the Republicans fielded the worst candidate they ever came up with, because there were 17 people in the primary and Trump was the loudest and brashest and pushiest. He ended up by default getting the nomination. And then the Republican won because the public was tired of the status quo. Because Flyover America in those precincts in Michigan and Wisconsin and Western Pennsylvania and Ohio said, enough of this. The jobs are all going offshore. Our standard of living is imperiled. And we want a change. So that's how he came in. Pure product of historical forces. But what is happening now is Donald Trump is such an immense egomaniac, is so clueless about his own, persona and how it looks to the rest of the world, that he is brashly taking control and throwing his weight around and using the symbols of office and some of the tools of office to create, I think, a fairly dangerous populist political movement in behalf of his notion of big government. Trump isn't a conservative. I mean, conservatives, Republicans were for smaller government, federalism, shift the power out to the states and localities, can't run everything from Washington. Use the free market wherever you can. Free trade is the route to prosperity. The Fed should stay out of the financial markets to the degree that it can. Let the pricing mechanism work its will, supply and demand. All these things, sort of roughly stated, are the core of what has been modern, conservative economics. Trump doesn't believe in any of that. He wants a $2 trillion infrastructure program. He thinks you can't spend enough money on defense, even though we spend as much as the next 12 countries in the world combined. He brags about his big tax cut, which mostly went to corporations to buy back their own stock. And it was funded on Uncle Sam's credit card. We didn't cut spending. I'm all for shrinking government and lower taxes if you cut spending dollar for dollar. You can't just keep borrowing money, building up the national debt, and passing it on to the next generation. When it comes to trade, Trump is a mercantilist, which means government-managed trade and government involvement in everybody's business as they try to buy or sell things around the world. He's in the middle of it, threatening or actually imposing tariffs on anybody that looks crossways, at least as he sees it, at America. So, he's now, what I'm saying is he inherited the office on a fluke because times were desperate. And now what we have is kind of an incipient authoritarian populist wannabe, I wouldn't, use the word dictator lightly, but he's trending more and more in that direction because unfortunately he's found the few points in our system where the presidency can act unilaterally without political consent or legislative enactment, and that's in trade. Unfortunately, we've got these statutes left over from the 60s and 70s that give the president enormous power to impose tariffs and manipulate trade in other ways for national security reasons or because of unfair practices by foreigners, which are totally undefined, that have given him an opening to basically run roughshod over our entire, trading system. And it's big. We do about nearly $5 trillion of business, $4.5 trillion of business a year with the rest of the world. And now Trump has got himself, right in the middle of it by abusing these powers. So this isn't going to help, obviously. Tariffs are not paid by China. He keeps saying that. They're paid by domestic consumers. And even more than that, we import a lot of semi-finished goods or components or parts from China, and then they're assembled and sold or finished and packaged here. All the people and businesses that bought that stuff from China are now paying, the 25% tariff on the first 250 billion of goods. And, I don't think that they solved anything at the recent G20. It was just another agreement to, kick the can down the road. I think the rest of his tariff is going to go into effect at some point. He's so oblivious to the subtle damage that's being done behind the scenes that he's likely to impose what I call the full Monty, the entire 25% on all 560 billion worth of stuff we buy from China. This will disrupt the supply chains that have built up around the world through China over the last 20 or 30 years in ways that people can only begin to understand and imagine right now. And the damage will be done before it's too late. We'll be in a recession, we'll be in trade wars, we'll be in nasty conflicts. Look at, he wants to put tariffs on European automobiles because allegedly they threaten national security. Now tell me how importing a BMW or a Porsche or a Mercedes sedan has anything to do with national security. It doesn't. It's ridiculous. And yet he's using the national security authority to threaten Japan, South Korea, the European Germans in particular, in this whole auto tariff war that's behind the scenes for the moment, but it'll be roared back onto the front page in a few weeks or months. So this is, further indication that what had been a passive fluke of history is now turning into an active assault on even what remains of American prosperity.
Right. What I like about the book, it really, you take no prisoners anywhere. It's scathing criticism of Trump, but you don't give the Dems or the so-called deep state a pass either, and you reject a lot of the Dem and mainstream media criticisms of Trump, like Russiagate and the collusion narrative. And like personally, I always say there's two strains of TDS. There's Trump derangement syndrome, and we've been fairly familiar with that for the last few years. But the other one I call Trump divinity syndrome. And that's the idea that he can do no wrong and he's playing some kind of 4D chess. And this book is obviously neither of those. I mean, when he named Powell to head the Fed, you mentioned Volcker, and I had in the back of my mind this, well, actually in the front of my mind, this hope that this Powell would be this generation's Volcker, and I thought, and it might cost Trump his second term because Powell will come in and he will normalize. But then very quickly, things became very evident that that wasn't going to happen, and Trump has browbeaten him into reversing course. And yet, and then a lot of people say, well, that's all part of the 4D chess that Trump is playing. But obviously, I mean, I don't think anyone can seriously consider that.
Well, unfortunately, his fanboys and fangirls and women and men seem to believe that. I mean, half of the personalities on Fox News believe that, yes, exactly as you describe it, he can do no wrong and he knows what he's doing. But here's the news flash that I have in my book, and I think anybody who thinks about it would recognize it. He's not playing 4D chess. He's not even playing checkers. Or I don't think he's even playing marbles. Maybe tiddlywinks, if you remember what that one. I don't know. I used to hear about it when I was a kid. I'm not sure what it was, but it was something fairly stupid. Trump is flying by the seat of his ample trousers every day. He makes it up as he goes along. It's all on whim. It's all on, whatever strikes his ego at the moment, either in a positive or negative way. And one thing, though, I like about it, it's got Washington tied in knots. They like on this latest thing on the census question about citizenship, the Supreme Court said, no, what you're planning to do, you can't do. The whole government thought, well, that's over. We're going to take the question off the census. Next thing you know, morning ago or two ago, he tweets, the question's back on. And everybody's trembling, shaking their head. But in some ways, he shakes up things well. We shouldn't be having 65 years after the fact, a continued crisis in Korea. We shouldn't have 29,000 troops on the Korean Peninsula. We should have let the Koreans resolve their differences decades and decades ago. Now, he at least had the impulse to say, let's see if we can find some way to talk this through, and maybe I can get them to put in some Trump golf courses and towers in North Korea and have them follow a different path. But the entire government is lined up against him. Now, Trump is his own worst enemy, of course. He put these advisors in. He said, we're going to have America first. We've regime change has failed. He had a pretty cogent critique of the disaster of Iraq. He raised the question during the debates, what the hell were we doing in Libya, Hillary? Why were you, bombing Gaddafi and opening up the bowels of the earth to the kind of warlordism and refugee crisis coming out of Libya today? So he had all the right impulses. He had the right impulse with Putin as well. He said, Russia is a tiny little 1.5 trillion economy. We're a 20 trillion economy. They don't threaten us. They don't have a blue water navy anymore. They're not suicidal. They're not going to attack us with nuclear weapons. Let's go see if we can resolve our differences and have some kind of rapprochement. So he had all the right impulses. That, frankly, that's why I voted for him. That's why I think a lot of people in what used to be called the old isolationist regions of America, the Midwest, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, where I came from and where I represented Western Michigan in Congress, he had the right impulses about non-intervention, getting out of this global policeman role and so forth. He gets into office and he surrounds himself with advisors who are interventionists to the core, neocon, almost war-lusting activist foreign policy establishment types. And everything he tries to do, they one way or another thwart him on, or actually actively cancel. He said, I think he said 5 times, we're getting out of Syria. We're still there. Okay, he's been totally misled on the Iranian deal. It's the one nuke deal. It's the one decent thing Obama did. He was told it's the worst deal in history, and there's nothing like telling Donald Trump that some other fool made a bad deal, because the Donald is always certain that he can make a better one. And so we're on the verge of a catastrophic confrontation, maybe military outbreak in the Persian Gulf, where 20 million barrels a day of oil flow through in the region, because he's gotten a totally misguided notion in his head that the deal was horrible, it needs to be canceled, and if you put enough threat and pressure and economic sanctions on them, they'll come to the table on bended knee and ask the Donald for a better deal. This is delusional, and yet my point is he's been led to that point by bad advice from his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, from his national security advisor, I call him the walrus, because he kind of looks like one, and Pompeo. I mean, where did Pompeo come from? You ought to go back to Nebraska and, back to the cornfields and Bible school or something, because he is an immense danger to our security as Secretary of State. So you have that, you have that inconsistency, that built-in conflict between good impulses that he would like to pursue and exceedingly bad advice from the entire national security apparatus. And remember now, and it goes to a point I think you were raising earlier, Trump was opposed 100% by what I call the deep state, or you can call it less conspiratorially, the Washington establishment or the bipartisan consensus.
This was my next question to you, actually. I was going to say, let's talk about the deep state, because we should put on our tinfoil hats now, because as soon as you use that term, you've almost disqualified yourself from serious discussion. So, sorry.
But you know something? You don't have to have a tinfoil hat. You only have to kind of absorb the news as it leaks out and ekes into our information ecosystem, and you realize that Russiagate was never real, and that a inner circle of the national security establishment during the Obama administration cooked this whole thing up in a desperate attempt to stop Trump's candidacy, when suddenly it dawned on Washington that this wild man who's never been part of the governing class in his whole life might end up in the Oval Office. And then once he got elected, they actually tried to sabotage his presidency. Now, it was Brennan, national security advisor first, and then head of the CIA, who led a small cadre of people, handpicked, as he called it, from the CIA, the guys at the top of the FBI, Strzok and McCabe and Comey, etc., in a out-and-out, abuse of the national security apparatus, the wiretapping of Carter Page. I mean, somehow, just because CNN says that this was all necessary and above board, and that there was some kind of, Russian hand behind the scene, you don't have to believe that. You can just ask one simple question. Donald Trump never met Carter Page, never met him once. Carter Page was some kind of, flunky who had gone to Russia during the heyday after the Iron Curtain fell, was a stockbroker for Merrill Lynch, got in the energy business, put out his own shingle, mainly failed, was looking for a way to get back in the action, signed up for Trump's campaign, and they were so desperate. And listen to this. This is March 2016. They were so desperate to show they had advisors besides whatever was under the Donald's orange mop on top of his head. They, in desperate, put this Foreign Policy Advisory Committee together. And I think it's important for people to, realize or remember the context. Sometime, as I recall, in February 2016, Trump was asked, well, where do you get your foreign policy advice? Who are your advisors? Where does your insight and your information come from? He got it by watching cable TV. Okay. And of course, there was guffaws up and down the establishment media. CNN clucked away at it for days, as did NBC and New York Times and the rest of them. And so his campaign team said, we got some damage control we need to do here. Let's put together an advisory committee. Now, the reason I'm dwelling on this is when they tried to put together an advisory committee to show it wasn't just cable TV, but that he was listening to at least some other people, the entire foreign policy establishment was boycotting the Trump campaign. They were all never Trumpers. And so he couldn't come up with anybody who had been in the State Department or Defense Department or National Security Council or Council on Foreign Relations or any of the other pedigreed, institutions of foreign policy. And they came up with people you never heard of. So a couple of them were whack jobs. We won't even go into that. But, they drafted Carter Page because he had been to Russia, and he knew a little bit about energy. Okay, now this is how he got on there, on his advisory committee. The advisory committee, by the way, met once on March 20th, I think it was, 2016, for a photo op. That was the extent of it. Now, here's what I'm suggesting. Why in the world would the national security apparatus, the FBI and the CIA, seek wiretaps against someone involved in the campaign of a major party candidate for president, when he had no role in the campaign at all? He wasn't even paid. He had no influence. These are known facts. You didn't have to have a wiretap to know that Carter Page had never been to Trump Tower. And yet they went to the FISA court and got a warrant that is meant to be a very difficult thing to obtain in exigent circumstances, and they got it against Carter Page. And then the next thing they did was they went after Papadopoulos, who was even more pathetic. He was 29 years old. I call him Baby George Papadopoulos, who, he didn't have a job either. Just gotten out of, by the way, he just got out of graduate school in 2011. Maybe I'm a little cynical about young people these days. I don't know if I should be, but here's a guy, he's out of graduate school in 2011. He has a couple of half-assed jobs. And all of a sudden, he now becomes a key link in this narrative created by Brennan and the FBI that there was this nefarious Russian scheme behind the scenes. The whole thing is a complete hoax. It's a complete crock. And I hope people understand, I'm not saying this from the point of view of a Trump deifier. I think Trump is a fairly dangerous character at the moment. But the reason it needs to be understood is it shows how much power the embedded ruling class in Washington has, bipartisan establishment that is there year in, year out, whether elected or appointed or in the advisory or bureaucratic roles. And when that establishment is challenged, they kind of attempt to eject it like a foreign body from that infects your body. This is what the whole Russiagate thing is about. And you could say, well, maybe we're through it all now, and we wasted 2 years and $40 million on a Mueller probe and so forth. But even Mueller said, there was no collusion. Trump won the election because Hillary was such a bad candidate, and because the establishment, after 30 years of rule through the Clintons and the Bushes and Obama in between, had failed important parts of America that had been left behind. That's why, and it had nothing to do with Russia. That should all be clear by now. But instead of understanding that, the Democrats have doubled down and have turned Russia, which is no threat to the United States whatsoever, none, zero, into some mighty ogre that if you even have a conversation with the leader of Russia, it's a sign of some treasonous betrayal, as they attempted to pin on Trump when he went to Helsinki and had a couple-hour meeting with Putin. Now, this is dangerous because in our modern system, the Democrats were always the peace party, in the Hawks and, Barry Goldwater and Curtis LeMay, bomb them back to the Stone Age and all that kind of stuff. That was in the Republican side, but at least there was a tension. There was a competition of ideas, and our foreign policy, wasn't totally bad, didn't become totally unhinged. But now the Democrats are the war party. And the Republicans have not lost their hawkish feathers, and the Republican Party is infested with neocon, interventionists and, they're warmongers, really. And this is a dangerous point. At this stage of the game, we ought to be leading the world to disarmament and peace. We should not be building an $800 billion defense budget, bombing, invading, occupying, droning half of the countries in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world, and looking for a fight with people that are not a threat to America. And by that I mean Russia, because it's a backward, small economy that isn't an expansionist power anyway. Its military budget is $60 billion. Ours is $750 billion. I mean, it's not even a contest. If you put all of NATO, the other 28 countries plus the U.S. together, we have $1.2 trillion defense budget. They got $60 billion. Where's the threat? There isn't any. And then to now say we're going to have a running conflict, almost a trade and technology and quasi-military conflict with China, is even crazier. China could not survive 6 months without the export markets in America and Europe. And there is no way that they're a military or security threat to anybody in Europe or America. As I say, if they try to bomb the 4,000 Walmarts in America, they would be bankrupt before we would be, because their whole rickety, debt-ridden, command and control, quasi-capitalist, quasi-communist economy is a house of cards. And we ought to understand that. We shouldn't be shivering and fearful about China. And yet that is being built up as well, because the people who should be, standing against those kinds of militaristic ideas and policies, the Democrats have become so compromised by this idiotic Russiagate thing that they're as hawkish as the Republicans. And that's a very dangerous thing. And unfortunately, regardless of who they pick of their 27, 25 candidates, there's only one that's consistently anti-war, Tulsi Gabbard, and they're doing the best they can to drive her out of the race.
She's a Russian stooge too now.
Oh yeah, that's what they're saying, exactly. Because why? She went to Syria and met with Assad.
Yeah.
And why not? Because he's probably the brute they say is. I don't know, but he's no worse than the guy the butcher who's running Egypt today. He hasn't beheaded as many people as the Saudis have. So the point is, if you aspire to leadership in America, you meet with foreign adversaries regardless of what you think of their policies or their character. Remember, Nixon went to China. He met with Mao. Mao Zedong starved 40 million people. He's the biggest perpetrator of genocide in history, even worse than Hitler or Stalin, and yet Nixon went to China. He didn't ask Mao to come here. He went to Beijing. He opened the door to China, and at least for a period of a few decades of normalization. Nixon went to Moscow to meet with Brezhnev. That's what you do when you're trying to navigate and have some kind of, peaceful policy, peaceful engagement with the rest of the world. Now here, poor Tulsi goes to meet with, a guy who runs an economy that he's got enough GDP to cover the U.S. in 10 minutes or something like that, 10 hours maybe. And all of a sudden, she's like some kind of stooge of our foreign enemies. That's how bad it's gotten. I went to Washington in 1970. I was fresh out of college and off the barricades. I campaigned against the Vietnam War. I signed a "We Won't Go" thing. I was a draft dodger. I don't have any compunction about admitting that because the Vietnam War was a catastrophe. Now, back in those days, there was a real debate in Washington between the military types and the Cold War hawks and people who wanted a more peaceful, less confrontational route. That's, where all these Democratic doves, Fulbright and Church and McGovern and all the rest of them came from. I'm not trying to recall nostalgia for its own sake, but just to remind people that at one time, at least Washington had a vigorous, wide open, unrestrained debate about whether we need to be the policemen of the world and about the appropriateness of various policies. Today, it's monolithic, and that's a very bad thing.
Right. You were pretty sure for a long time that Trump wasn't going to last the term or be a one-term president. What has your thinking shifted on that at all?
Well, he's obviously lasted longer than I thought he would. On the other hand, it's because he's riding the inherited, economic expansion and stock market bubble. It's lasted longer than I thought possible.
Don't they always? Yeah.
Yeah, but then they do end. They said in 2000 this time is different. There's a technology revolution, so forth and so forth. And then the stock market collapsed for 2 years, 80% on the NASDAQ 100. People were carried out left and right. Their life savings were wiped out and so forth. Everybody forgets about that. Then we had the great crisis of 2008, 2009. Allegedly, we were heading towards, some kind of economic black hole from which we would never return. Everything collapsed, and all the complacency that attended the bubble. Remember Goldilocks economy in mid-2007, late 2007. In fact, I can show you quotations from the spring, early summer of 2008, in which they were all saying, Bernanke at the Fed, the chairman of the economic advisors to Bush, that no recession's in sight, when if you look at the record books right now, the recession started in December 2007. All right, so we always get this denial, absolute militant denial right up to the edge of when these sequential bubbles finally, reach their sell-by date and then splatter all over. Now, I thought that was going to happen right after Trump was elected because clearly he's a disruptor that's going to wreck everything. But instead, the Fed continued to, nurse this bubble longer, and then the ECB added to the life extension. And so Trump has benefited from that. And the question is, he'll be easily reelected if somehow the bubble can be extended through November 2020. But if it collapses, which I think it will in the next year, it'll take the economy down. Unemployment will soar. The stock market will drop by 30, 40% or more. And every single thing that Trump has been boasting about will be played back nonstop in the Democratic ads against him. And all his tweets lined up. Can you imagine the gallery of fools when they're going to just line up every one of those tweets as the economy, meets its day of reckoning. So we don't know the answer to that right now. It is binary. It is on-off. And I can say this, I think, with some experience, because as a young kid on Capitol Hill, I was right there when Nixon's day of reckoning finally happened. I worked for the Republican leadership at the time, the number 3 Republican in the House, John Anderson from Illinois, who eventually then ran as an independent candidate. But he was part of the Republican leadership, was constantly down to the White House hearing all the lies from Nixon about, Watergate and all the rest. But I remember at the time that here's kind of the way it came down. In January 1973, Nixon came off a landslide victory. He didn't squeak through like Trump. He won with 44 million votes to 28 million. He had 500 votes in the Electoral College. McGovern had almost none. Nothing like Trump's squeaker in the middle of the night. He was riding high. The stock market was booming. The economy was strong. They thought he was invincible. 18 months later, he was on what I call the Dick Nixon Memorial Helicopter to Gainesville, And here's the thing. For the first 12 months of that decline, Republicans bit their tongue. I was part of the staff that served the leadership, and therefore I was in the back room, so to speak, the closed-door meetings. They all couldn't stand him. They all were, they were beside themselves with anger that he was going to take down the whole Republican Party and wipe out the House and the House and Senate Republican delegations in the 74 election. But nobody said anything until the stock market began to fall apart in early 1974, in the spring of 1974. And then it became like something broke the dam, and all the Republicans came out of the woodwork. One by one, they went after him. And finally, they sent in Al Haig to say, "You're done. The helicopter, the engines are warming up. You'll be on it at 10 a.m. in the morning." Now, that's how fast it happens, see? And whether, if therefore we get the same kind of, and I think the fact I wanted to mention is that from Nixon's peak, and it's kind of my peak Trump idea, but this is peak Nixon, January 1973 to August 74, when he got, was put on the helicopter, the stock market declined 38%. 38%. But it happened slowly and then of a sudden, as they say, and it changed the whole political environment, the whole political narrative. And that's why Trump is so vulnerable. If this stock market bubble finally breaks, and remember, we saw what can happen in December. I wrote Peak Trump in the fall last year, and the market had peaked at 2945 on the S&P 500. By Christmas Eve, it was down to 2350, 600 points down. That's how fast it happened. And of course, then the Fed pivoted and they they kicked the can one more time, but I think they're out of dry powder. My point is, when the market starts to unwind, there's going to be nothing down below because the Fed is out of dry powder. I mean, when you have an interest rate at only 2.4%, how are you going to cut it enough to make it? Remember in 2008,
they'll go negative.
Well, if they go negative, they'll have, I think in America anyway, I don't know what's wrong with the Europeans living with these negative rates, but in America, you go negative interest rate and you will have torches and pitchforks, descending on Washington, because that is theft of the life savings of tens of millions of people in the baby boom generation who are going to be dependent on Social Security plus whatever meager savings they have. So they can't go negative here. And the reason I think it's so important is that when the Lehman crisis happened in September 2008, right before that, the summer before, the interest rates were 5.25%. That was what the funds rate was. So they had 525 basis points of cutting available, and they had a relatively clean balance sheet. The balance sheet of the Fed was only $900 billion. And so in the next 3 or 4 years, the rate went from 5.25 to 0, and the balance sheet went from 900 billion to 4.5 trillion. That's what rescued the economy, but it only created, it only deferred the day of reckoning. It rescued Wall Street. It didn't do a lot for Main Street. Now, when the next crisis comes, they don't have any room to expand their balance sheet further. They could try, but I think that would be a catastrophe. And they don't have much room to cut interest rates. So we're kind of on the razor's edge here. We're on a knife's edge of risk being totally ignored both by Wall Street and particularly the incumbent occupant of the Oval Office. But you know, things can change very quickly when the break comes.
Well, you know, that feels like a good place to end it. We've been going for close to an hour, and it is July 4th for you guys. Well, it's July 4th here too, but we're in Canada, so we had our holiday on Monday, I guess. Why don't you let us know where your website is and how we can follow your work, and if you're working on any other books right now?
Yeah, well, I publish this kind of thinking every day in a thing I call David Stockman's Contra Corner. And we cover Wall Street, Washington, fiscal policy, the Fed, what's happening in Europe and Japan, the trade war, the red Ponzi, as I call it, and then the whole foreign policy front and you know, the unwinding of the American empire as we stumble around the world, making things worse rather than better. And you can easily find that by simply Googling David Stockman's Contra Corner. And you can go to the website and sign up for the daily subscription. I also put out books from time to time, and we got a couple more in the pipeline that maybe will be available in a year or so. Maybe it'll be post-Trump. I don't know. We have peak Trump, we had pre-Trump, we had peak Trump, and I hope it's post-Trump, but we're likely to get only worse before it gets better, unfortunately.
That's I was going to bring up things like democratic socialism and modern monetary theory, which would be post-Trump, but maybe we have to save that for next time. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, well, very good. Happy to.
All right. Thanks. So that is David A. Stockman, Peak Trump. The audiobook is available now. I'm going to put links to his website and newsletter on the show notes page, and we will see you next time. Thank you.